In the dense forests of north-central Missouri, there is a stretch of land few locals venture into. Known on old survey maps as Lot 17A, it's a tangle of overgrowth and limestone ridges silent undisturbed for over 100 years. Until the spring of 2021. A group of archaeology students from the University of Missouri conducting routine soil sampling in the area stumbled upon a curious formation square-cut stone protruding just beneath the earth too symmetrical for natural geology. They began to dig. What they uncovered were the foundations of a building that did not exist in any known record. A large rectangular structure with load-bearing limestone walls nearly 3 feet thick. No blueprints, no permits, no listing in county archives. And yet, the building had clearly stood. Drone footage reveals what little remains cornerstones wrapped in ivy-rusted hinges embedded in stone, an old well sealed with concrete. Trees grow where corridors once were. Buried under 6 feet of soil, the team found a staircase descending into darkness. Cautiously, they entered. The air was still impossibly dry. Their lights revealed narrow hallways lined with chipped white tile, rusted grates, and remnants of what looked like padded doors bolted shut from the outside. One of the students captured video brief and shaky of a long corridor that ended in a collapsed wall. Along that corridor, faded letters were stenciled on the wall: Bloom Institute, Ward C. No one in town had heard of it. No state medical records listed it, no newspapers ever reported on it. And yet, the building was real, built, used, and hidden. That discovery set off a chain of questions that would lead investigators, historians, and forensic teams deep into one of the most disturbing chapters of early American medical history. A chapter buried not just beneath soil, but beneath shame, silence, and deliberate erasure. Because this wasn't just an unregistered asylum. It was something else, something far more calculated. And what happened here between the years of 1911 and 1919 would challenge everything we thought we knew about medicine memory and the price of scientific progress. In the summer of 1911, Missouri newspapers carried enthusiastic headlines about a newly established charitable organization called the Bloom Foundation for Nervous Disorders. Behind it stood a name few recognized at the time: Dr. Elijah Bloom, a young neurologist recently returned from Europe after 4 years of research at medical institutes in Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. He was not born into wealth, but came from a respected family of preachers near Columbia. What drew attention from the medical establishment wasn't his pedigree, but his radical ideas about the human brain and how to fix it. In a public address before the Missouri State Health Board that June, Bloom described the brain as a faulty electrical machine prone to shorts, misfires, and circuitry errors like any man-made device. Children aren't mad, he said. They are miswired. His remarks were widely quoted with local papers, heralding him as the man who may usher in a new age for the mentally deficient. At the same time, the Bloom Foundation announced construction of a new research and care facility in the wooded hills north of the town of Crowsfield, more than 40 miles from the county seat. The land had been donated by a local landowner who received in return a generous and undocumented sum. The new facility, known as the Bloom Institute, would serve children diagnosed with a variety of conditions: epilepsy, stunted development, obsessive fixations, severe social withdrawal, and what Dr. Bloom vaguely called unidentified degradations of neural order. Public reaction was warm and unquestioning. Crowsfield was a conservative farming town where any initiative bearing the word charity was welcomed without suspicion. The idea of a cutting-edge neurological center nestled in the hills was seen as a blessing. Dozens of families began submitting applications to admit their children. Preference was given to orphans and children from homes deemed unfit for long-term care. Applications were processed rapidly, and within 3 months nearly 100 children were slated for intake. Throughout this early campaign, Bloom and his staff used language that quietly deviated from accepted norms. The children were not referred to as patients, but as subjects of adaptive therapy. They weren't being cured, they were being neurologically reorganized. And most notably in internal memos unearthed decades later, Dr. Bloom repeatedly used the term low-order signal disruption, a phrase no one else in the medical field at the time seemed to recognize. Funding came from multiple channels. Some from philanthropic families in St. Louis, industrialists whose own children had suffered from behavioral disorders. Some from the state of Missouri, quietly authorized through a special clause inserted by State Senator Harlan Beechwood, a longtime friend of the Bloom family. Equipment arrived from Europe through private shipments, the origins and procurement records of which remain impossible to verify. Among the manifests preserved, one included a list of items described as early electroencephalographic apparatus, directional audio response chambers, and neuromodulation delivery devices via cerebrospinal route. Construction progressed swiftly, 8 months start to finish. Workers were brought in from neighboring states. None were allowed to view the full architectural plans. Each was assigned to a single section and required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. One carpenter from Arkansas later recalled being dismissed for questioning why certain children's dormitories required soundproofed steel doors and underground passages. In February 1912, the Bloom Institute officially opened. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no journalists, no public announcement. Just a single administrative notice confirming the facility's approval to operate under the classification of a juvenile neural rehabilitation and study center. Families received formal letters of thanks for their trust, along with reassurances that every therapeutic process shall be monitored using the most modern scientific standards. And then quietly, the children began to vanish from the public eye legally with signed documents, stamped approvals, and no further questions asked. No one suspected then that they had placed their children at the center of one of the most terrifying scientific experiments in the history of American medicine. There were no immediate signs that anything was wrong. Letters sent from the Institute to families were formal and infrequent, but generally positive in tone. Parents were told that their children were adjusting well, that treatments were progressing, that there were some difficulties with adaptation, but overall improvement was expected. The letters bore the signature of an administrator named Edgar Wilkes, whose credentials no one ever fully confirmed. They were typed on thick stationery embossed with the Bloom Foundation's crest, an abstract rendering of a human brain enclosed in a laurel wreath. But the letters stopped, gradually, then completely. When families tried to contact the Institute directly, they were told when they received responses at all that their children had been transferred to a more specialized facility, better suited to their needs. No addresses were given. No further communication was encouraged. Those who traveled to the location on Crowsfield Hill found only a heavy iron gate locked and a stone wall that wound through the woods for nearly half a mile. There was no sign, no reception desk, no bell to ring. Sometimes, if they waited long enough, a man in a long coat would appear from the trees and explain that the children were not accepting visitors due to sensitive treatments in progress. They were asked to leave. Some families accepted this. Others returned multiple times, waited at the gate, or tried to speak with workers during shift changes. But few got answers, and those who pressed too hard eventually received cease and desist letters from the Bloom Foundation's legal counsel citing interference with medical care. The town of Crowsfield remained largely indifferent. The Institute was isolated from daily life, and few locals worked there. Those who did cooks, janitors, delivery men rarely spoke about it. When asked, they would only shrug or shake their heads. A few claimed they had signed documents forbidding disclosure. Others simply said, "I don't go past the main kitchen," or "they don't let us upstairs." Rumors started to take shape. Children being kept underground. Rooms where the lights never went out. Sounds, sharp rhythmic pulses carried on the wind late at night. But nothing ever reached the papers. The Bloom Foundation was still seen as a benefactor to the region, its other branches, an outpatient clinic in Jefferson City, a donor wing at the University Hospital frequently featured in society columns and medical journals. What remained hidden was the Institute's true purpose. Later, investigation into surviving paperwork would reveal detailed intake forms, extensive psychological assessments, physical measurements, even cranial circumference charts, all of it compiled with unsettling precision. Each child was given a numeric identifier and placed into one of 3 categories: receptive, resistant, or neutral. The criteria for these designations were never fully explained. Within the Institute's central archive, recovered in fragments decades later, were floor plans of a facility far larger than anyone imagined. It included soundproof laboratories, observation chambers with one-way glass, and a circular underground theater referred to only as Chamber E. There were no medical supply requisitions for antibiotics, basic children's medications, or standard hygiene products, but there were repeated orders for electrodes, acoustic transducers, insulated wiring, and electrical stimulators adapted for pediatric use. Test logs, what little could be recovered, referenced protocols such as N3 auditory response mapping and Phase 2 sublinguistic interruption. In one document, children were described as nodes of pure neurological potential. Another referred to preverbal cortex redirection through compound frequency conditioning. There were no signatures on these logs, no dates. Just numbered files, many of them incomplete, charred, or water-damaged. Still, a pattern emerged. The Institute was not attempting to cure neurological disorders, it was attempting to overwrite identity. To reprogram the brain not through medication or surgery, but through controlled sensory input light, sound silence rhythm. The idea was not new in theory, but here at Crowsfield it had been enacted on real children. Quiet children, forgotten children. Children whose only mistake was to be born vulnerable and to be handed over to a man who believed he could reshape thought itself. And outside those walls the world moved on unaware. Among the few surviving internal documents of the Bloom Institute was a report, incomplete and unsigned, listing 57 children by first name and identification number. Next to each entry was a single-word label: active, non-responsive, or terminated. No dates were provided. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note in faded ink: begin phase delta. Only after third audio sequence yields frontal attenuation in toward 4 subjects. The language was clinical cold and unmistakably experimental. Mina Talbot appeared on that list. She was 10 years old when she was admitted to the Institute in March of 1912. Her intake file described her as quiet observant, prone to night terrors, and intermittently mute since the death of her mother. Her cognitive assessment showed above-average reasoning skills and rapid visual memory. Physically healthy, emotionally withdrawn. Her father, a widower, unable to care for her, had surrendered her under promise of restorative care and neural adjustment. Mina, like many others, arrived with a single suitcase, a Bible, and no expectation of ever returning home. According to recovered staff schedules, Mina was placed in Section 2CA wing designated for auditory repatterning. This wing was structurally isolated from the rest of the building, its halls lined with thick cork and steel to prevent sound from entering or escaping. The children in this section followed a strict schedule: 6 hours of silent study, followed by sensory sessions in the acoustic chambers, and then medical checkups recorded only by code. There were no teachers, no toys, no spoken language allowed after arrival. They were observed constantly, their reactions documented in red-bound notebooks kept under lock. A surviving entry written in careful script by a staff member identified only as H47 details Mina's first session. Subject 2, C019, displays minimal resistance. Exposed to 17-minute tonal loop sequence delta 4. Pupil dilation normal. Breath irregularity noted at minute 11. No verbal response. Initiate repetition protocol next session. There are dozens of such entries, short and emotionless, spanning weeks. Each one tracks her exposure to a series of controlled auditory stimuli, some barely perceptible, others loud enough to induce tremors. The goal, it seems, was not therapeutic. It was behavioral conditioning to see how far the mind of a child could be altered through tone frequency and silence. Other children responded differently. Some withdrew completely, refusing food movement or eye contact. Others became hyper-compliant, answering questions before they were asked, echoing phrases whispered into their rooms the night before. One boy, age 9, began referring to himself in the third person after 4 sessions. A girl named Eloise scratched symbols into her skin using the edge of her tin food tray symbols that later matched notations found in Bloom's unpublished research on prelinguistic impulse redirection. There were no records of parents being updated. There were no records of children being discharged. And in the archival ruins of what was once the Eastern Wing recovery teams found remnants of a narrow corridor with numbered metal doors, each one scorched from fire, each one bearing only a small porthole reinforced with wire mesh. Behind one door was a rusted nameplate, Mina T. Long before the first child entered the Institute, Elijah Bloom had already begun sketching his theory of the mind not as a fluid constellation of thought and emotion, but as a closed system of electrical patterns and predictive impulses. In a series of unpublished notes recovered from the estate of a colleague decades later, he described consciousness as a looped circuit susceptible to rerouting and memory as a synthetic byproduct of repetition, not truth. He did not see fear, grief, or disobedience as psychological phenomena, but as interruptions in the system, interruptions that could be neutralized with the right calibration. This theory became the foundation for what Internal Institute documents called the map. It wasn't a map in the traditional sense, but a schema of colored pathways, symbols, and pulses corresponding to various regions of the brain. It combined elements of early neurology, phrenology, and a speculative model of cortical control that Bloom claimed to have observed during his time abroad. The goal was not to teach children, nor to treat them, but to align their responses with a fixed sequence of conditioned inputs, what Bloom referred to as compliance loops. Each child admitted to the Institute was subjected to a battery of tests during their first week. They were photographed from multiple angles, measured, placed in silent isolation chambers for up to 12 hours, and monitored during exposure to rhythmic stimuli, blinking lights, alternating tones, breath-regulated audio playback. Their heart rates, eye movements, and muscular responses were recorded, cross-referenced, and indexed. Those who showed early adaptability were placed into Phase A, basic auditory conditioning. Others, like Mina Talbot, were funneled directly into Phase B, which involved more invasive methods. These included periods of enforced silence lasting up to 5 days, during which the child would be observed for signs of spontaneous vocalization or behavioral regression. If they remained silent and still, they progressed. If they cried, screamed, or spoke, they were returned to earlier sequences and restarted. One document referred to this progression as flattening the peaks, a metaphor for removing unwanted neural spikes. Another described it more starkly: emotion is noise. We are here to find the silence beneath it. To enforce these protocols, the Institute developed an internal hierarchy among its staff. Therapists were not healers, but calibrators. Sessions were recorded using early phonograph equipment with notations coded by date tone sequence and subject response. There are mentions of a chamber referred to only as Room 5, where experiments involved synchronized multisensory immersion, pulsing light, harmonic feedback, temperature modulation, and even induced vertigo. Children who exited this room often displayed what the records called baseline submission, a state of docility, vacant gaze, and unbroken eye contact. A handful of letters written by staff members to relatives never sent but later recovered from an abandoned mailroom in the Western Wing reveal growing unease. One assistant wrote, "I no longer feel these are treatments. We are not mending the mind. We are emptying it." Another wrote simply, "There is no music in them anymore, just reaction." What troubled some staff, and perhaps what most delighted Bloom, was that the process worked. To a point. Children who had once been difficult to reach became eerily compliant. They followed commands without prompting, recited words in unfamiliar languages, or remained motionless for hours. Some no longer recognized family members when shown photographs. A few stopped blinking entirely during observation sessions. One boy, after 2 weeks in Room 5, reportedly began to speak in reverse phonemes, nonsense sounds that, when played backwards, mirrored the audio sequences used during his sessions. These were not cures. They were transformations, not restoration, but replacement. By the winter of 1912, the Institute was fully committed to what Bloom called Phase C, the creation of fully modulated child mind subjects no longer burdened by trauma history or resistance, only programmable silence. In late December of 1912, the snowfall around Crowsfield grew unusually heavy. For 2 weeks, the surrounding hills were blanketed in silence. Supply deliveries were delayed, and several staff members were unable to leave the Institute for the holidays. It was during this period, according to scattered journal pages later found beneath the floorboards of the Western dormitory, that something shifted inside the Institute, something Bloom did not anticipate. The journals belonged to a young assistant named Clara Voss, a medical trainee from St. Louis sent to observe the Institute's non-invasive protocols. Her entries began formally describing procedures' chain of command and the daily monotony of sensory trials. But after December 19th, her tone changed. She wrote that several children in Section 2C had stopped responding entirely, not with resistance, but with an unnatural stillness. Not sleep, not fear, something else. She described one child sitting upright for 12 hours without blinking, another humming a sequence that no one recognized until it was matched to a tonal pattern from a test administered weeks earlier. Most disturbing, she said, was Mina Talbot, who had begun tracing circles on the walls with her finger. Perfect concentric circles. She never looked up. She never acknowledged when spoken to. But each circle was exactly the same size, each line unbroken as if drawn by machine. On December 22nd, Clara wrote of a low-frequency sound that seemed to reverberate through the lower halls, a tone no one admitted to playing. She asked a technician if it had come from the phonograph room, but the equipment hadn't been active. "It's not just noise," she wrote. "It's being remembered." Staff began to show signs of fatigue. 3 assistants reported migraines. 1 collapsed in the corridor outside room 5 and could not speak coherently for hours afterward. The Institute's director of operations, Edgar Wilkes, whose name appeared on all external correspondence, was last seen entering the sublevel archives. He never re-emerged. Internal messages stopped circulating. Meal delivery carts remained full, untouched. Several sections of the Institute were found unlit, though power had not failed. A nurse named Estelle reported seeing 3 children standing motionless at the end of a hallway at 3 a.m., facing the wall, humming in unison. When she approached, they scattered without sound, returning to their rooms as if nothing had happened. Clara Voss's final journal entry was dated December 24th. It read, "They've stopped listening. I don't know how to explain it. I think they've gone somewhere we can't reach. Not dissociation, not madness. Something deeper, like they've heard a sound we never will, and now they're bringing it back." That was the last trace of her. The Institute's records show no entry or exit logs after that date. The snow deepened, sealing the roads. And by the time the January thaw came, the Bloom Institute of Neurological Advancement had gone completely silent. By the time the thaw came in early January 1913, the surrounding woods were thick with rumors. A rancher from the southern edge of Crowsfield claimed he saw smoke rising from the chimneyless wing of the Bloom Institute. A hunter found a trail of ash leading from the river bend to the Institute's back gate, despite no recent fire in the area. But when the county assessor's office sent 2 men to deliver notice of overdue taxes, they returned unsettled, refusing to speak of what they'd seen beyond the frost-covered gates. One simply said it's not abandoned, it's asleep. Officially, the Institute was declared inactive due to winter damage and sealed pending inspection, but no inspection ever took place. A single telegram from the Bloom family attorney instructed local officials to preserve the property until further notice. The request was honored without challenge. And so, for over a decade, the Institute remained untouched, locked, unvisited, and preserved like a sealed wound in the hills above town. In 1926, during the expansion of Missouri's rural electrification program, surveyors revisiting the area reported structural shifts in the building's foundation. A committee was formed to investigate whether the structure posed a safety threat. What they found was not collapse, but calcification. Entire corridors were encased in salt and limestone deposits, as if something inside had changed the chemistry of the air itself. Rooms sealed by natural crust. Walls blooming with silent crystal. Electrical lines within had fused not from fire, but from heatless overload. Behind one warped steel door, they discovered a chamber completely lined in copper. Inside, 3 wooden chairs all bolted to the floor, a shattered phonograph, and on the far wall, drawn in charcoal, hundreds of overlapping concentric circles, some faint, others heavy and burned into the plaster. The surveyors recorded these findings, then filed them away. The committee disbanded quietly 2 months later, and once again the Institute was left alone. It wasn't until 1954, 41 years after the Institute closed its doors, that anyone re-entered with intent to catalog and preserve. The effort was led by a small historical preservation society funded by private donations, many of them anonymous. Among the volunteers was a linguist named Eleanor Hesse, a former cryptographic analyst for the War Department. Hesse became particularly obsessed with the Institute's records, what little remained. She discovered patterns in the children's hums, matching them to sequences used in early military signal jamming. She reconstructed bits of Mina Talbot's tonal recordings from warped reels found in the collapsed West Wing. One of the sequences matched a classified wartime file she had once reviewed during her federal service, though she could not disclose which. In her private notes later published posthumously, Hesse wrote, "It's not music, it's mapping. The children weren't being trained, they were being tuned." Her work never gained traction. The Preservation Society dissolved in 1956 under financial strain, and the Institute was sold for back taxes to a private buyer. The buyer's name was redacted in all county filings, but before the building changed hands, Hesse left one final note with her archivist. It read, "Do not restore, do not reopen, let the silence hold." In 1962, a routine geological survey near Crowsfield unearthed a sealed sublevel beneath the Bloom Institute, one not listed on any architectural plans. The crew had been drilling for core samples when the earth gave way, revealing a staircase choked with dust and iron mold. Emergency lights from the rig illuminated the first few steps leading into a narrow descending shaft carved directly into bedrock. Within hours, the entrance was quietly reported to state authorities and sealed by order of the land's current owners. But before it was closed, 2 members of the survey team descended. Only one came back. The survivor, a man named Thomas Reeve, gave no formal statement. His hair had turned white within days. He refused interviews and left the state within the month. According to his wife, he never spoke of what he saw, only that it was not built for walking feet and sounded like memory folding in on itself. Reeve died in 1971 after nearly a decade of silence. The existence of the sublevel remained unacknowledged until 1985, when a leaked photograph, grainy and overexposed, surfaced among a batch of declassified Cold War documents. It showed a chamber with no corners, its walls rounded and seamless like the interior of a shell. On the floor, 7 metal chairs facing inward, and in the center a single upright cot encircled by a ring of stones etched with patterns resembling both brain scans and musical notation. The document bore no date, no origin, but handwritten on the back in a script later confirmed to match Eleanor Hesse's were the words, "They shaped, sound like it was a knife." Efforts to investigate the chamber stalled repeatedly. Researchers reported hearing faint pulses in the walls, irregular but patterned like breathing or coded taps. Some experienced nausea, hallucinations, or memory loss after brief exposure. One technician reported hearing a voice whisper his own name in perfect pitch. The audio logs picked up nothing. A memo circulated through a federal division tasked with decommissioning abandoned research sites. It concluded, without explanation, that the sublevel should remain sealed due to potential residual auditory weaponization. The cot remains. The chairs remain. And every 6 weeks without fail, the motion sensor inside the sealed sublevel registers a single movement. Then nothing. In 1993, a university research group from St. Louis received a private grant to study aberrant acoustic architecture in pre-modern institutions. The language was deliberately vague, but the coordinates pointed to one place, the Bloom Institute ruins. At that time, most of the structure had collapsed or been reclaimed by forest, but the sealed sublevel remained undisturbed. The team, composed of 5 graduate students and their advisor, arrived with permission from the private landholder, an LLC registered in Delaware with no listed members. They brought sound mapping equipment, infrared scanners, and custom parabolic mics designed to isolate faint resonances from deep surfaces. For the first few days, their recordings captured only wind, the echo of shifting stone, and rodent activity. But on the 4th day during a storm, one microphone picked up a tonal pattern at 4:17 a.m., 12 seconds long, buried beneath layers of static. It was a rising tritone followed by a low hum, then silence. They played it back. Within the hour, 2 team members began vomiting. One student described a sense of being outside her own head. Another grew fixated on the copper wiring in the old main hall, saying it reminded him of veins. They returned to campus early, turning over their equipment and notes to the university. Nothing was ever published. The data was quietly flagged by a federal acoustics lab in Virginia. A classified report later leaked concluded that the audio contained a frequency pattern capable of inducing vertigo disorientation and short-term memory fragmentation. But it also hinted at something more, what the report called non-random linguistic ghosting, in which words never spoken aloud seemed to register in neural trace. The recording was eventually labeled MN Delta 1912. The only remaining copy sits in a secured archive, unplayable without special clearance. But unofficially, those who have heard it describe a moment just before the hum ends, a breath unmistakably human, drawn in not as speech but as if remembering how to breathe. And then, in that final pause, a child's voice so faint it seems imagined humming what might be a lullaby, a tune not heard in over 80 years. In 2007, a privately funded neuroscience initiative operating under the name Corvus Research Group submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for access to the MN Delta 1912 file. The request was denied. Within months, the group relocated to a remote compound in northern Missouri, purchasing hundreds of acres near the now inaccessible ruins of the Bloom Institute. Officially, they were listed as a sleep study facility, but local records show extensive underground modifications and irregular power usage during peak night hours. 2 years later, a whistleblower and electrical engineer hired to maintain the facility's power grid leaked photographs and internal logs to an independent journalist. Among the documents were schematics for a resonant induction chamber and transcripts of tests labeled echo reinstatement. One transcript recorded a subject exposed to a specific tonal sequence who began speaking in archaic English and reciting lines from medical documents written in 1912. The subject had no prior exposure to either. Another file noted a recurring outcome after prolonged exposure. Several participants ceased dreaming altogether. Not insomnia, just silence, flat EEG activity during REM cycles. No images, no symbols, just unbroken black. The engineer claimed that the chamber design was based on a partial reconstruction of the Bloom Institute's sublevel, specifically the cot-centered room with 7 inward-facing chairs. He said the team believed it was never meant for treatment or restraint, but for transmission. Not communication in the ordinary sense, but something older. Something closer to imprinting. Before the journalist could publish, the story vanished. The journalist disappeared during a solo hiking trip in Oregon. Her laptop was recovered weeks later, wiped. The engineer died in an apparent home accident electrocution via compromised breaker panel. Official investigations were inconclusive. Corvus Research Group disbanded in 2011. Their compound was sold under court seizure and demolished. No artifacts were recovered. The land now stands empty. And yet, in late 2021, a music theory forum on the dark web posted a file titled Talbot_lullaby_restored.aif. It was anonymous. No metadata. Just a 6-minute audio track of faint humming layered over low tonal pulses. Several listeners reported headaches, sleep paralysis, and waking visions of a girl drawing circles. Within a week, the file was removed. The thread was deleted. But copies circulated, stored offline by those who still believed the Bloom Institute was never meant to cure anything. It was meant to remember something we were never supposed to hear. In early 2022, a digital forensics team tracing residual activity from the Talbot_lullaby_restored.aaf file found something deeply unsettling. Embedded within the audio spectrogram when visualized using an oblique frequency resolution was not just a waveform but a shape. A spiral identical to the ones described by Clara Voss in her 1912 journal entries. Not metaphorical, not random, but precise, each coil evenly spaced, ending in a void at the center like a fingerprint burned into silence. The team traced the file's origin to a dormant IP address once registered to a now defunct military acoustic lab decommissioned in the 1980s. But before the lab shut down, it had been investigating a phenomenon known internally as echo null propagation, the idea that certain resonant frequencies could cancel not just sound but memory. One surviving log described an experiment with a prototype chamber during which all 5 participants forgot their names for 27 minutes. When questioned afterward, each had drawn the same spiral, unaware of one another's drawings. A linguist who reviewed the Talbot recording noted that the tonal intervals mimicked lullabies used in early 20th century orphanages, but slowed and flattened as if reversed through time. She also identified whispered phonemes beneath the hum, most of them indecipherable except for one repeated phrase folded into stillness. Researchers who listened too long described auditory hallucinations of children, whispering from behind their own ears like memory seeping inward. One woman claimed she felt her childhood shift details changing events unraveling, as if her past had been rewritten by something inside the sound. The file is now considered a neural hazard by multiple underground archivist networks. Playback is restricted. Discussion is limited, but its legend has spread among niche corners of the internet known only by a single symbol, a spiral drawn counterclockwise ending in silence. And in a university archive in St. Louis, a locked box belonging to Eleanor Hesse was quietly reopened after decades. Inside fragments of phonograph tape, a child's sketch of a spiral in charcoal, and a single typed line on aged paper. They're not gone. They've just gone quiet. ChatGPT Danoy. In late 2022, an archivist named Leah Bram, tasked with digitizing forgotten state records, uncovered a sealed envelope misfiled in the Missouri Department of Public Health Archives. Inside was a carbon copy of a report dated February 1913, signed by Dr. Walter Adlin, once an inspector for mental health institutions. The document had never been cataloged. Its contents were not referenced in any official history. Adlin's report detailed an unscheduled visit to the Bloom Institute prompted by an anonymous letter from a former attendant warning of unethical procedures and an unnatural silence among the children. Adlin wrote that he arrived unannounced and was met with resistance. Staff insisted he return with proper clearance, but he bypassed them and entered through an unlocked rear ward. What he described was not cruelty or violence, but absence. Children, sitting for hours in unbroken stillness, their eyes open, their mouths moving silently as if rehearsing dialogue without sound. Some pressed their ears to the walls listening. Others moved in mirrored patterns synchronized without cue. Adlin followed one boy who traced a spiral on every door he passed, each mark identical in size. In the center wing, Adlin discovered a chamber with no name. There, 7 children sat in copper chairs arranged around a bed. The bed was empty. When he approached, one child began to hum not loud, but clear. The hum contained a series of tones that made Adlin feel as if time were pressing inward. He left before the sequence finished. He submitted the report but never received a response. According to his final note attached to the back of the envelope, he later returned to the institute at night intending to record further evidence. He was never seen again. Leah Bram traced the anonymous letter mentioned in Adlin's file to a woman named Clara Voss, who had briefly worked as a caregiver at the institute. Voss disappeared in spring 1913. Her final journal entry, recovered from a cousin's attic, simply read, "They never stop humming, even when you leave the room." In early 2023, a Missouri-based audio engineer named Davis Klein began an independent project reconstructing lost regional soundscapes using archived phonograph recordings. While digitizing a batch of 1,910 S-era reels from the state's orphanage system, he encountered a file labeled only MT Session B. Its paper sleeve bore no date, just a faint spiral drawn in pencil. Klein expected the usual degraded folk music or ambient chatter. Instead, the recording opened with silence nearly a full minute. Then came a hum. Low, layered, impossibly steady. Not mechanical, not natural. The kind of hum that didn't sit in the air but underneath it. Beneath the surface of hearing. Then a girl's voice, young but deliberate, intoned a series of vowel sounds, each rising into complex harmonics. Klein immediately stopped the playback. The levels hadn't spiked, the file hadn't corrupted, but his left ear rang for nearly 24 hours. He described the sensation as pressure behind the eyes and hearing something that wasn't being spoken. Curious but shaken, he consulted a colleague in neurolinguistics. Together, they ran a spectrum analysis and found that the voice followed no known melodic scale. Instead, it matched the frequency ratios used in early neurological entrainment experiments, specifically those attempting to stimulate deep memory access in patients with aphasia or trauma-induced amnesia. More disturbingly, the harmonic sequence at minute 217 matched the acoustic fingerprint of MN Delta 1912 long believed lost or fictional. The two tracks, separated by decades, formats, and recording devices, were undeniably linked. Klein traced the initials M.T. to Mina Talbot. It was one of the only surviving vocal samples from her sessions before the Bloom Institute shuttered. According to a forgotten funding ledger, Session B had been conducted in a copper-walled chamber built off-site, one never officially listed on any institutional blueprint. Klein's partner urged him to destroy the file. Instead, he encoded it into a spectrographic image layered into a public audio restoration blog without comment. Within days, several visitors to the page reported vivid dreams of an underground room and a girl in a white smock turning slowly in a circle, humming through closed lips. None of them had heard the audio. In the summer of 2023, a quiet initiative called Project Mimesis began circulating among academic circles, an interdisciplinary research effort claiming to study archived phonetic trauma and its transgenerational impact. On the surface, it seemed like another fringe acoustic psychology experiment. But buried in its citations was a reference to Talbot Session B and a single chilling phrase, "Residual imprinting persists beyond exposure." Leading the project was a neuroscientist named Dr. Adrienne Hale, known for her work on echoic memory and auditory hallucinations in PTSD patients. She had long suspected that certain sound sequences, particularly those embedded with patterned human breath, could act not as memory triggers but as memory vectors. Not recalling, but inserting. Her team began collecting unmarked wax cylinders, early dictaphone reels, and rare field recordings from Midwestern institutions operating between 1905 and 1920. Their pattern emerged slowly, any sample containing long tonal hums, copper-based chamber resonance, or childlike vocal harmonics produced side effects in listeners subtle but replicable. Distortions in sleep cycles, familiarity with places never visited, emotional reactions to names never heard. One test subject began drawing spirals during REM monitoring, unaware of doing so. Another, under mild hypnosis, recited a passage nearly identical to the notes of Eleanor Hesse. He had never read them. But it was during a closed-session playback of a composite audio assembled from dozens of fragments across the Bloom Institute's history that something new happened. The lights flickered. Not mechanically, but rhythmically matching the pulse embedded in the sound. Dr. Hale herself described a moment of displacement, a sensation not of remembering, but of being remembered by something older than thought, as if the sound itself was conscious listening back. After that session, several researchers withdrew from the project. One destroyed their entire archive. Another entered a fugue state, muttering only one phrase for hours. "It's not a lullaby, it's a map." Project Mimesis was formally discontinued. All files were boxed, sealed, and marked for indefinite suspension. But in the margin of Hale's final note written in her own hand, one last sentence remains. If it's a map, then something is still trying to find its way back. In October 2023, a retired technician named Harold Keyes contacted a small network of digital archivists claiming to possess the last unplayed reel from Bloom. Most dismissed him. Stories like that surfaced, often almost always fabricated. But Keyes provided a photo, a rusted steel canister marked BT-1913E. Its label faded, but intact. More compelling was the location he had found it sealed behind a false wall in the basement of an old train depot converted into storage. The depot sat just 22 miles from where the Bloom Institute once stood. The archivist met him. The canister was real. The reel inside was damaged but recoverable. They rented equipment, restored what they could, and after days of delicate work, played the audio. It began with static, then a hiss, followed by faint footsteps on a hard floor. Then the sound of a door opening. Silence, then breathing, then humming. This time not a child. An adult voice, quiet, familiar, matching the vocal profile of Eleanor Hesse. But beneath the humming was another layer, a child's voice, slightly delayed, echoing each note like a shadow. The two tones aligned only once, at minute 4:46, forming a resonance so deep it triggered a brief audio dropout on the equipment itself. Those present described a sudden shift in the room temperature, drop pressure change, a sense of something passing through. One listener, an acoustics expert, began crying without knowing why. But it was the final 10 seconds that ended the project. No humming. Just a phrase whispered in the voice of the adult. She's still in the circle. Don't wake her. And then, unmistakably, the voice of Mina Talbot, recorded in 1913, repeating that same phrase syllable for syllable, as if from inside the same breath. The archivist deleted the digital copy. The reel was burned, but one of them, before the deletion, transcribed what they believed to be hidden in the harmonic structure. Not words, not images, coordinates, latitude, longitude, pointing not to the old institute but to a nearby field, undeveloped, silent. When authorities visited the site after an anonymous tip, they found disturbed earth. 7 small copper chairs half buried in soil, and in the center a ring of polished stone, clean, untouched by time,